Okay, on the syllabus tonight is supposed to be the intertestamental period, the history of Israel during the time of Jesus, and Greek and Roman history. We're still back in October 19th, Persian history, but I think we'll get through that. There's a lot of history to cover, but some of it's going to have to be bird's eye view, I guess. We've talked about before the return, and there were actually three returns, one under Zerubbabel and Joshua, and one under, and the dates usually are 537 under Joshua and Zerubbabel, and the second under Ezra, 458, and the third under Nehemiah, 445. And some people want to have Nehemiah as the second, Ezra as the last, but most people will have it in that order. We talked about the decree where Cyrus allowed people to go back home, and that decree is found in Ezra chapter 1, 2 through 4. And there's a little bit of question. We don't have time to get into it too much. In Ezra 1 and verse 8, it talks about a return under a person Sheshbazzar, and that's probably a Babylonian name, Ezra 1:8. Some people think that it's some Babylonian official. Others think it's Shenazar, who is in 1 Chronicles 3:18, a son of Jehoiakim. And then others think it's maybe Zerubbabel. But we don't have all that worked out. There's a return under Joshua and Zerubbabel. And we've talked about the total number that returned under them it was almost 50,000. And as they settled in, they built the altar and ordered material for the temple, and the foundations were laid for that temple, and they broke out in joy and song. But there were those who remembered Solomon's temple, and it wasn't such a joyous time. Yet they faced other problems, so there's discouragement there. I mean, they're back in the land. They've returned after Babylonian slavery. And there were other problems because of outside forces. The Samaritans opposed some of this. What's usually the origin or the background of the Samaritans?
Repopulated northern kingdom.
Yeah.
And outsiders brought in by the Assyrians.
Yeah. In 722, when the northern kingdom went into Assyrian slavery, they brought in people and they intermarried, and there were still, some of the northern kingdom in the land, and so that's thought to be the origin, and that's what Kings tells us about the Samaritans. But they're back in the land, and the Samaritans wanted to help, demanded to be a part of that, but their religious practices were syncretistic. They were worshiping all these other gods and the Lord. So that whole thing came to a halt for 16 years. They're back in the land, but it's not like it used to be. And it sure reminded them of why they ended up leaving the land. And they did because they didn't listen to God. And that's what Kings makes clear. Thoughts, comments on that before we talk about Ezra and Nehemiah? Okay, we talked about before that when they went into Babylon, as Jeremiah said, settle down, make homes, and seek the welfare of the city. But some, when it came time to return, didn't want to return. They had pretty good lives in Babylon. And there became, religious center in Babylon. There is a Talmud, which is commentary on the Hebrew Scriptures, and there's a Jerusalem Talmud, and then there's a Babylonian Talmud, Talmud. And when under the Babylonians, they just, Daniel tells us how to survive life in exile. And Daniel is faithful to God. Daniel's friends are faithful to God. And so that's how you survive life in exile, is being faithful to God. Peter talks about these themes a lot because, in a sense, we're in exile in this world, and we're to be faithful and in communication with our home country, which is our citizenship is not here, citizenship is in heaven, Paul says. So, yet then when the Persians take over, there wasn't very much, change with the people. It's just, some more people. But we've talked a little bit about the Persians and how that Cyrus the Great is the one who took the city of Babylon, but Cyrus really wanted to conquer the world, and that's what he's seeking to do. He's Cyrus the Second, and his son, well, he died. He was wounded in battle as he was still trying to conquer the world, and his body was returned to Persia for burial, and his son is Cambyses. He succeeded, and he had already been acting because his father's off doing things. And I'm not going to get into all this in too much depth, but Cambyses did away with his brother because he didn't want any rivals to the throne. And he continued conquering, and he even goes down into Egypt, and so he's conquering some of that land. And when he's on his way home in 522, word reaches him at Mount Carmel in Palestine that there was somebody who was masquerading as his brother that he murdered, who said he was the brother and he was going to take the throne. Well, he knows it can't be his brother because he killed him. He murdered him. And so he's going to get back and take care of that, but he died in 522. We don't know exactly how, but most sources suggest suicide. One of his officers took control of the army, marched it back to deal with this insurrection, and his name was Darius the First. Now, he's not the Darius in the book of Daniel, as we've talked about that. This is later. So Darius the First, he put down the revolt, he seized the throne, put that person to death, and he recorded his triumph on a mountain cliff that's 350 feet above the road that leads to one of the capitals of Persia, Ecbatana. And that is known as the Behistun inscription. And that's a pretty significant find because it's written in Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian. Akkadian is cuneiform, like, symbols. And that became invaluable in deciphering Akkadian because Persian was known when this was discovered. And so by looking at, you have like something that's in 3 languages, and they started looking, well, that's the word for this, that's the word for this. And so that was a key in unlocking Akkadian. Darius did that, and he was a capable leader like Cyrus. And he added kingdoms, and he had an intricate postal system, but he's making uniform weights and trade and all that kind of stuff, and that has some problems in inflation. He didn't win any friends, really. And he's making massive building projects during this time as well. And he wants to build another palace at a place called, the Bible calls it Shushan, or Susa. And that's the palace where Esther and Nehemiah both lived and served. And he didn't finish that project. His son and his successor is Xerxes, and that's the king in the book of Esther. He finished that and moved the capital to Persepolis, another place. But there's pretty much peace in the Persian Empire during all this time, in this succession of kings. And around this time, Xerxes is trying to still conquer a lot of places, and he goes through Syria, Palestine, and he's on his way to Egypt, and it's at that time when there was some dispute in the land where the Samaritans and the governor Tataniah, I think is his name, is questioning the Jewish people, saying, where do you have authority to do all this building? And they said, Cyrus the Great gave us this authority. And he said, well, where's the proof of that? And so they searched in the records and they found all that. He's traveling through just at that exact time, and he resolved that question, and they went back to work. Darius remained in Susa. He got back to Susa, and he wanted to conquer the Greek world at that time. And he is moving through Asia Minor, but he gets to Athens, and the Athenians met him in a pretty decisive battle of Marathon, and the Persians were defeated. It was almost humiliating. The Greeks the Athenians have defeated the Persians, and he was forced to retreat. And he kept wanting to get revenge over that, but he died. And so all that's left to Xerxes, his son. And if you look at Esther chapter 1. And the king, notice in verse 1, it says, it came to pass, or it happened in the days, in the Hebrew is Akashaverosh. Akashaverosh. That's, I guess, Ahasuerus, however you want to pronounce that. Akashaverosh. That's much like the Persian name, but this is Xerxes. His Greek name is Xerxes. But you notice in verse 1 there, it says it came to pass in the days of Akashaverosh. It didn't say King Akashaverosh. It just says Akashaverosh. Now in verse 2, you have in those days when the king Akashaverosh sat on the throne of his kingdom. But the question in this book is, who's really the king? God's a king. He's in control of all of this. He's the Xerxes. And he had to deal with Babylon. He's still trying to, revenge his father over the Greeks and all that. But his main interest seems to be completing that palace at Susa. And finish the other, Persepolis, the other place. And he's still interested in fighting the Greeks to defend his battle. But in a battle, he lost 200 Persian ships in a naval battle. And so finally the Greeks said, you're not conquering us. And so there's really little for him to do now. He turns really, from history it tells us, to indulgence, that he had numerous sexual encounters. And this would be after the book of Esther. But he has numerous sexual encounters, and that became his undoing, it seems, in history. He died at the hands of somebody, I guess a jealous husband or an enraged court official. Some suggest the commander of the palace guard. So and we'll back up, we'll circle around, come back to Xerxes in just a moment. But the last important Persian official was Artaxerxes the First, and he doesn't have an easy job. He tries to reduce taxes his father had put on the land, and more people began to revolt and say, we're not paying the taxes, and that creates unrest. Egypt says, we're not paying taxes to Persia anymore, and they said, we're going to get the Greeks to help us, to support us. And Artaxerxes bribed Sparta to turn against the other Greeks, compromising that league. And this is during the time of the great orator and philosopher Pericles and the Peloponnesian Wars at that time. Well, that's Artaxerxes the First, and he died just about the time the Old Testament is completed. All right, let's back up a little bit now. Let me stop and see comments, questions. During the early years of Darius's reign, that the temple had stalled, and so it resumed. And we have in Ezra 3 and verse 8, it begins again, and there are two prophets that are active during this time, Haggai and Zechariah. and they urge the people to finish, and they start really, I think, with the preaching of these two prophets. And in no more than 24 days from the first message of Yahweh through Haggai, the people picked up where they had left off and resumed the work on the temple, and that's the second year of Darius. Yet there, as we said, was opposition from the Samaritans, and they want to know, well, how do you have authority to do this? And they searched around, and they found a copy of Cyrus's decree at the capital in Ecbatana. Ezra 6 through 12 gives that information. And then we come to Esther. Let me look. I took a picture of a table of contents in a book I was reading the other day. I thought was really good. Yeah, it says, Daniel, how to maintain distinctive faith in exile. Esther, how to survive in exile, because it's, and as you know about the book of Esther, it's come down. Almost the Jewish people are wiped out. And then Ezra and Nehemiah, how to rebuild a nation. I thought those chapter titles were really good. So in the book of Esther, and almost all critical scholars deny the historicity of Esther. Because they say, well, you don't have, it's our only witness really to what's going on in Xerxes at this place at this time. But the author doesn't contradict anything else that we know anywhere else in the records. So it reads as history, and I believe it is history, and it is inspired. So it begins in Susa, that's the winter palace of the Persian kings. It's the third year of Xerxes, Ahasuerus, and his empire did stretch from India to Ethiopia, as Esther tells us here. This lavish banquet that's going on here corresponds to what we have in other places. Herodotus is a historian, ancient historian, and he writes about some of these things. And this corresponds to some things he writes about a great council or meeting to plan the invasion of Greece. So, he's still trying to take care of that. So this banquet that opens the book of Esther corresponds to that. And at the end of this banquet, as you know, Xerxes orders his queen Vashti to pose before these drunken revelers. And this banquet continues on a long time, doesn't it? And what is described in the text here, it is a drinking banquet. That's what it is. It's the word for drink, to drink. And so that's what they're doing. And he orders her to pose before the drunken partiers, and she refuses, and so there's a search for another queen. That probably was interrupted by the Greek campaign before the new queen can be installed. And of course the winner is Esther, a young Jewish orphan, and she's there with her older cousin Mordecai. Now those are pagan names, Esther and Mordecai. Mordecai is related to Marduk, the god Marduk. Esther is Ishtar, the goddess Ishtar. So apparently up to that point they hadn't revealed who they are. Now we do know Esther's Hebrew name, Hadassah, which means myrtle, in chapter 2, verse 7. So Esther is made queen, and it's Xerxes' 7th year, but there's conspiracy in the palace. And we're told in 2:19 that, let me make sure that's the right reference. Yeah. Mordecai sat in the king's gate. Walter Kaiser is an Old Testament scholar, conservative Old Testament scholar, evangelical, and he suggests that the picture here is not Mordecai like begging, just sitting there begging. He says the king's gate would be all of the auxiliary buildings that are associated with the king's work. And he even suggests, to sit means to have this place at the king's gate. He suggests that Mordecai might be in his office. It's an office that's here, that he's working for the king. Well, and we don't know all that. It just says to sit at the king's gate. I don't think the picture is he's sitting there as a beggar. But he hears some things, doesn't he? What does he hear?
The plan to kill the king.
Yeah, plan to kill the king. And there might be a lot of people talking about getting rid of the king because of this whole Greek war, all the battles that are going on with that Greek campaign. Anyway, he reports that to the king through Esther, and it was made a matter of record in that. And Kaiser suggests Mordecai may have then become official title, benefactor of the king. And one of the privileges of being benefactor of the king is you did not have to bow before anyone except the king. And so that might have been behind the idea, I'm not bowing before you, Haman, or Haman as we pronounce it. Well, angered by that, Haman somehow learns that Mordecai was Jewish, and he persuades Xerxes to sign this decree that all the Jews will be killed and they get their property. This is very famous and very good. What did Mordecai do and say to Esther? That's right. And he says, if you don't do it, God will raise up somebody else. And you, who knows, for this time, such a time as this, God has brought you to this position. So what you have to do is disclose that you are Jewish and what this means to your people and my people. So at this banquet with Haman present, Esther reveals what Haman is about to do, and doesn't go very well for Haman. Xerxes orders his execution, and he orders the Jews to defend themselves, and it's about 11 months when they cast the lot, the Pur, P-U-R, to choose the date of the murder of the Jews, and 75,000 of the would-be executioners die. And that Pur is a little clay die, and it was determined things, that need to be in the hands of the gods. And so it's for that reason, if you look at Esther 9, 26 through 28, that this feast comes from this, and it's called the Feast of Purim. P-U-R means die. All right, questions, comments on Esther?
Time frame wise, I know this is during the exile, but is it before Nehemiah's time? I remember reading and studying this. There were different people have different
Certainly.
about that, where it falls. So.
I think it's before Nehemiah. It may be about the time of Ezra.
Yeah. Kind of in between.
Yeah, kind of in between that time.
Where I've landed on my studies.
Yeah.
Probably in between the.
It's pretty complicated, to get all that sorted out.
Because there's quite a bit of time involved here.
Yep.
Because the first half of Ezra is quite a few years before the second half of Ezra.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
And apparently Esther fits in between chapter like 6 and 7
Yeah.
of Ezra. Is the best that I could
Yeah.
figure out.
It's during that time, I guess you could say there's been a return, but in a sense, they're still in exile. So it's a transition period. It's a good comment, good question. Anybody else on Esther? The Feast of Purim is still a feast that Jewish people celebrate. It's a pretty festive feast, and they read through Esther, and anytime Haman's name is mentioned, everybody stomps their feet. And they're noise makers and things associated with it. And it is really a significant account too, because I mean, God has to be working in all of this, because the Jewish people would have been destroyed. All right.
They would have eventually got, because Xerxes ruled all those provinces, they would have eventually got down to Jerusalem and killed the ones there too. Even though some had returned,
Yeah.
they would have killed them as well.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Anybody else? Thank you. All right. So as Scotty mentioned, there's some chronological details that get a little difficult. Both Ezra and Nehemiah date the years of their return to the reign of Artaxerxes. And Ezra 7:8, the 5th month, the 7th year of the king, and Nehemiah, the 20th year of the king. But the question is it's not just one person named Artaxerxes. So the question is, which Artaxerxes, the first or the second?
Is that regarded more like a title, like Pharaoh?
Could be, yeah, could be. If it's the first, then Ezra returned to Jerusalem in 458, and that would be after the Feast of Purim, so they'd put Esther before this, and then Nehemiah later, or Esther's in the middle of all this, or after Ezra and before Nehemiah. It's difficult to work all that out. When Ezra is going to return, he assembles a small group of some 1,500 men. That's a lot less people than 50,000. And Ezra discovered there were no Levites among the 1,500 men, and so he delayed his return till he could persuade some 38 Levites to go with him. Finally, they depart on the 12th day of the first month, 458, and they arrive 3.5 months later in Jerusalem. That's Ezra 7 and Ezra chapter 8. And the king had given him some concessions. He was to bring the gold and the silver that they would take from the temple. He was to draw on the royal treasury for any additional needs. The temple people didn't have to pay Persian taxes. He could appoint magistrates in the land, and he could enforce Torah with power of life and death over the guilty. Even with all of that, the prospects of returning home were not too tempting to a lot of Judeans. And he arrives in the land, and he is, in Ezra 7:12, he's called the scribe of the law of God of heaven. So he's the delegated from the Persians representative in the land. And somebody suggests that's roughly equivalent to he's the minister of Jewish affairs in the land. The Persians realized that this is good politically for us. And when he gets in the land, the people didn't really receive him with enthusiasm, and there were some matters they had to take care of. The chief one was the matter of marriage outside of Torah, even priests and Levites. That's in Ezra chapter 9. And he was stunned that they had just disregarded Torah, and in Ezra 9 he pours out his heart to God. He tore his clothes, tore his hair, and sat appalled. Slowly they gathered around him, and somebody suggested that they put away their foreign wives and children in Ezra chapter 10, and they agreed on that. They came to the public square to carry that out, but then they found this is going to be too big of a job to do here in a short time. And Ezra 10 tells us it's a cold rainstorm too when they do this. So they set up a divorce court in Ezra 10, and for 3 months they take care of those matters. Nehemiah had risen to cupbearer under Artaxerxes, and he hears what's going on, and he hears a small delegation that included his brother came to him, and what he hears is not encouraging. and they I guess want to bring it to Nehemiah because he has some power, in the government. And the report in Nehemiah 1:3 is the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, its gates have been burned with fire. And there's turmoil in Syria, Palestine at this time. The governor of Syria had subdued Egypt, and he took some Greek and Egyptian commanders, prisoners, to Susa. And the promise was, we're not going to kill you. You're under Persian protection. And that lasted a couple of years until Xerxes' widow, we don't know why, but she demanded that they be executed. And they were. And that infuriated that governor of Syria because he had promised his protection there. And things had changed. Well, he announced, okay, I'm going to be independent from Persia now. And when they got word of that, they said, okay, we'll take care of the matter. And so he comes back and he's faithful to the Persians. But all that happened just around 2 years before Nehemiah asked Artaxerxes for permission. So with stuff like that going on, Artaxerxes, in Syria, Palestine, you don't want all that turmoil if you control all that. So Nehemiah spent 4 months praying about what he had heard, and the king came in and saw that his face had fallen, he was disheartened, and Nehemiah told him the distressing news, and Artaxerxes is more than prepared to grant his request. So again, it's not, I serve your God and so I'm willing to do this. It's got a lot of stuff going on with these in politically in the land. So it's best to have somebody there. And whatever you need, you take. That's in Nehemiah chapter 2. And Nehemiah arrived and things were worse than probably he had even thought. There was the city and the walls in ruins, and there was opposition from the Samaritans about that. And Nehemiah gathered the leaders together, and he gathered from all classes of society, and they began working on different sections of the wall, Nehemiah 3. And workers came from outside the villages to work as well. And there's opposition immediately from the Samaritan, and their name, Sanballat, from Samaria. And what's crazy is his daughter later married a high priest in Jerusalem. Yeah, in the temple. He's known from some other sources outside of the Bible as well as a governor of Samaria. And he's aided by Tobiah, who's called an Ammonite official in Nehemiah 2, verse 10. In other sources, he's the governor of Ammon. And then there is Geshem. He's a chief from a tribe in Arabia. And so that's more than enough opposition to start thinking about, well, just forget the whole thing. And they mock, and they found that didn't work. And so they took more drastic action, and they sent guerrilla soldiers around to attack. And they got other people to help, the Ammonites, the Arabians. There were sneak attacks, so much so that Nehemiah, and I know you know this, he stationed armed guards to protect the weak spots in the wall. And so seeing that they're now armed, that kind of cooled that down a little bit, for attacking.
Were they viewing Sanballat and all them, were they viewing this as like a potential buildup by the Persians or just the Jews themselves that would be a big problem military-wise, or they might try to encroach on their land or something? I mean,
Well, they're enjoying,
very
yeah.
opposed just from day one, to everything. So.
I think it's they see this going on, and their prosperity's going, they're prospering, and they see that as being attacked.
It's going to cut into their
Yeah.
deal,
A trumpeter stood by Nehemiah at all times, and he had to summon the people to attacks. And as you know, the people had a sword by their side as they had tools with them, Nehemiah 4:18. And those who were outside Jerusalem were instructed to remain in the city and sleep with their weapons right by them. But then that leads to other problems because if they're workers and they work like farmers and others outside, and now they have to stay in here, they can't work out there, and they still got to pay taxes and things, and so they would mortgage their homes and their vineyards, and some in Nehemiah 5:5 even sold their children into slavery to raise capital. And Nehemiah is angered by how the wealthy are taking advantage of all this. They're making money. And so,
This is all the group that came back at the beginning of the
yeah,
war, but,
yeah,
again, several years prior.
yeah.
They haven't rebuilt the city, but they've set up
Yeah, they're trying to make a living out there.
their own little system here.
Yeah, certainly. And so in Nehemiah 5, the nobles and the officials promised Nehemiah they'd stop exploiting the poor and taking advantage of people unfairly. And then you still got the enemies out there, the Samaritans and the other guys. And they tried to take Nehemiah by intrigue. 4 times they tried to get him to come meet with him, but he refused to stop his work to go in Nehemiah 6. In a 5th attempt, they sent a letter accusing him of conspiracy to rebel against Persia and make himself king. And Nehemiah didn't even see that as a charge. I'm not even going to reply to that. Finally, Sanballat and Tobiah hired a prophet, a false prophet, to advise Nehemiah, as he's from God, that he ought to take sanctuary in the temple to avoid assassination. But Nehemiah remains unmovable. And so in less than 2 months, 52 days, the wall was finished, Nehemiah 6:15. In the next 2 years and 4 months, the gates were strengthened. Nehemiah appointed his brother as in a position of leadership, and they were to keep the gates locked until the sun was up in the sky and have a guard at all times. Now, Judah is a small, before exile, the land was, it's a pretty large area. During this time, it was roughly about north and south about 25 miles. That's Judah. And the western boundaries, we don't know that. On the east by Jericho. So it's a lot smaller than what it used to be. They dedicated the wall and with celebration and proceeded around it. And then Nehemiah left Jerusalem for a short time to go back to Susa. And then he was given a second leave from the court, and he found that the enemy now was not so much the outside forces, but again the people themselves. There's internal dissension. There's infidelity. There's intermarriage with non-believers. They were operating wine presses on the Sabbath. They were bringing fish and merchandise into the city on the Sabbath. And Israelite men had once again married women from Ashdod, Moab. And this is the text where it says their children spoke no Hebrew, but the language of their mothers. And even Nehemiah's old enemy, Tobiah, had befriended Eliashib, the high priest, and he's housing in the temple quarters. Crazy. Nehemiah chased off Tobiah, and he appealed to the leaders, close the gates on the Sabbath. And they tried to get around that by selling stuff outside the city, and Nehemiah says, I'm going to remove you. He warns them. And how long he remained in Judah this time we don't know, and it's not known if he ever went back to the Persian capital. In 407, sorry about that. In 407, there is a document still going, AJ? All right. That tells us that Nehemiah there was another governor in Judah. And so he's not there in 407 BC. All right, thoughts or questions on Nehemiah, or Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther? and talk a little bit about the prophet Malachi. All right, Malachi is the last book in our English ordering. The last book in the Hebrew ordering is Chronicles, because we've talked about the threefold division of the Hebrew Scriptures is law, Torah, prophets, and writings, called the Tanakh, T-A-N-A-K. I think that Bible you have, Scotty, is it the title say Tanakh? Yeah, I think. That's the threefold division: the Torah, the law, and the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings. But Malachi is the last book in our English ordering, and he's the last writing prophet of the Hebrew Scriptures, and probably during the time of Nehemiah. Malachi, like Ezra and Nehemiah, calls the people to repent, and instead the people are offering, from Malachi, they're offering just lip service and disease sacrifices and gifts that don't cost them anything or a little to God. And they had also violated the marriage vows. And Malachi says God will send his messenger of the covenant, and there will be a purified remnant. And in that day, the Son, S-U-N, of righteousness will rise with healing on his wings, or in his wings. And that's looking to Messiah. Okay, we're going to move now to what's called intertestamental period. Any questions, thoughts before we go there? All right, everybody has that background. We're going to kind of follow some of that. And theoretically, I want to get up to like the time of Jesus and maybe starting a little bit of Acts. And so the last class, we will look at the situation in the book of Acts. We may get there tonight, I don't know, but up until the year 70, AD 70, because something significant happened then. This section is, or this time period is usually called intertestamental period. Now, of course, that's assuming that a person believes there are two testaments. And so here's the intertestamental period. Another name for this is Second Temple period. That's what a lot of scholars call it today. And there's a lot of history that's here and political developments. And the primary source that we have for Israel during this period is the writer Josephus. Josephus writes what's called the Jewish Antiquities. It's a 20-volume work on the Jewish people. And he writes later on the Jewish War, and he was an eyewitness of the war from 66 on. Josephus was a general in the Jewish army, and he was up around Galilee, and the Romans are moving through. And Josephus convinced another guy. He said, we need to hide. And so they got in a well, and they were hiding up around Galilee. And while they're in the well, Josephus convinced that other guy. He said, the noble thing to do is not be captured by the Romans, but to kill ourselves. And he convinced that other guy, and then Josephus said, you go first. And then when they captured Josephus, he said, I can be a really valuable resource to you. And he traveled the whole land, and he wrote Antiquities later, but he wrote about the war as an eyewitness. And Jewish people hated him, because that, and he writes, in the first person, he said, like when the Romans had besieged Jerusalem, and he's standing outside the walls, and he said, Josephus is standing outside the walls, and when the Jewish people inside saw Josephus, they threw a stone and hit Josephus in the head. Josephus fell down. They thought Josephus was dead, but he's not. Josephus was able to get back up. And they set him up in Rome after the war, and he had a nice house, and he wrote for the Romans. He says he used to be a Pharisee. But anyway, and he does exaggerate a lot. He always puts himself in a good light. But and has been questioned. Is his history, trustworthy? In fact, I don't know if you've ever heard of Terry Briley, Dr. Terry Briley at Lipscomb. He did a PhD at Hebrew Union in Cincinnati, and his dissertation was on the trustworthiness of Josephus. And he concluded Josephus, though he exaggerates, is trustworthy as a historian. So his writings really are very valuable about this time period. So there's a little bit other information from things like usually called the Apocrypha, the hidden books. That's what that Greek means. And those are books that are usually accepted by Roman Catholics, but not by Protestants. And there are additions to the canonical works like Daniel, and Esther has an addition. I think end of Daniel, there's an addition that Daniel is, I think it's in Daniel, so wise, and they said that the gods are doing something, and Daniel said, because the priest said the gods are doing something in the temple, because you get up the next morning and the food's gone, and he spread out the flour on the floor, and the priest, you go in there next morning, you see the steps coming right from where the priest quarters were to the food. He pointed that out. Bel and the Dragon, I think, is an addendum to that. Those works, again, they're not very valuable as history, but they're valuable of the times. There was also pseudepigrapha written in somebody's name, usually older, ancient people. But among those writings are two books, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and they're probably the most valuable among all the Apocrypha and the pseudepigrapha. And 2nd Maccabees is not viewed as valuable as 1st Maccabees. So it's usually thought 1st Maccabees is a historical work. So that's where a lot of this information comes from. And this era is important because usually, like if we study Old Testament history really doesn't deal with this. But you get and look at New Testament introduction or survey or something, that usually deals with this because it lays a lot of foundation for what's going to happen when the New Testament opens. There's a lot of political things. There are like the Pharisees and Sadducees, the synagogue. All of that has roots in this time period. And when we look at Galatians 4,
At the end of the Old Testament, because of Nehemiah and Ezra's work, the Jews were very united. But then when you open up the New Testament, they're not united at all.
yeah, and that's due to a lot of these things that are going on at this point. Yeah, yeah. Somebody read Galatians 4:4, maybe 4 and 5 to complete the sentence.
But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth His Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons.
Okay, so that phrase, fullness of time, that means it's the exact right time God sent His Son. And so we believe in providence and the providence of God, and God's working even in this time period between the Testaments, and it sets up some bad attitudes among the people, but also there are some things that are good that come out of this. And one thing is Pax Romana, Roman peace. Also, the Greek language is spread throughout the world, and the New Testament's written in Greek. So at the exact right time, God sent His Son. So there's a lot of developments that are going on here. We're still in Persian rule, and Artaxerxes died, and nothing really earth-shattering happened with that. Life continues just like it did in Nehemiah, Haggai, and Malachi. And but there are some developments during that that time, during the Persian period. One is the rise of the synagogue, and the other is the beginning of oral law, Torah. And we don't know exactly, can't pinpoint exactly the origin and the time of this, but it's during that time. If there's no temple where you can go, then the Jewish people need to meet, and they meet in these synagogues. Synagogues is a gathering together place. And really during this time, and now in Judaism, since the temple has been destroyed, second temple has been destroyed in 70, what they say is, since you can't offer sacrifices, then prayers of repentance and good works take the place of that. So there was and they're certainly not going to go back to idolatry. They learned that lesson. And so synagogue is thought to have its origin during this time. Also during this time, since we didn't listen to Torah, we know that's a law, so that's how we got into captivity, there's an emphasis on Torah and how it applies to all of life. And out of that arose oral doctrine, oral teaching about that. And that's significant even in the time of Jesus. I mean, no rabbi would say, I say this. A rabbi is going to say, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shema, Rabbi so-and-so said this. And so they quote all these authorities. In the Sermon on the Mount, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, it says the people are amazed that Jesus taught them with authority. But in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, you've heard this been said, but I say to you. That's that authority, and they're amazed at that authority. But there's all this oral commentary, and it's in the writings that developed during this time. Some of it's interesting, but their whole book, God says keep Sabbath holy. You don't work on Sabbath. What does that mean, don't work on the Sabbath? And they would say, well, if you lift something that weighs more than a dried fig, then you've worked on the Sabbath. You can't do any kind of work on the Sabbath. You can't look in a mirror on the Sabbath because you might see a hair that's out of place and fix it, and you've worked. If you cut yourself, you can wrap it up, but you can't put medicine on it, because you put medicine on it, it works. The medicine's working on the Sabbath. All kind of things. And the Pharisees are, they're steeped in all of that. You can't go, so far on the Sabbath day, and they would tie a string from one house to another house the day before the Sabbath, because that makes those two connected, and that becomes then one building. Jesus says, I'm just amazed, and he tells the people. Yep. A count of it, or a number of it. There's 613 laws, positive and negative, but oral law, I don't know. There are volumes of in its commentary. And for a Pharisee, anything that a rabbi said on it became scripture. So
it had the commentary on the law, then it had the commentary on the commentary.
Yeah.
It went several layers deep.
Yeah.
Jesus refers, to the traditions.
Yeah. And again, tradition is, there's like people today, we got to get, we're going to be non-traditional, get rid of tradition. You get rid of traditions, you'll make new traditions. It's but traditions are not on the same level as God's Word. And traditions can be good because it's a certain way that we do things. I saw a cartoon one time, they were leading a guy to the gallows, and the guy shouted out, I told him not to change the order of worship. So we do things a certain way, and if you throw all traditions out, you'll start new traditions. I'm sure you heard the story of the newlyweds and the wife is going to cook meatloaf, and she takes two pans and she puts part of it in one pan and part in the other pan. And her husband said, "Why are you dividing it up?" And she said, "My mother always did it this way." And so I guess he pressed the issue, and then, and they said, "Well, I'm calling her to find out why she did it. I don't understand why you had to put it in two pans." So they called her, and she said, "Well, my mother always did it." And then they called Grandma, and she said, "Because I didn't have a pan big enough. That's why I divided it in two pans." So traditions get passed down that way. And traditions can be good, but traditions are not on the same level as God's Word. And that's what happened with all this. It's like putting a fence. And again, if I want to set limits about my life about certain things, that's my choice, that where God is not specified. But if I start saying where God is not specified that my limits must be bound on you, then that's something different. It becomes legalism. It's interesting, to read their commentary, but oral law developed, and it's on the same level as written law. All right, a third thing, and then we'll stop for a break, is Aramaic became the language of the empire, and it's a cognate of Biblical Hebrew. In fact, some of Scripture is written in Aramaic, but and there's still Biblical Hebrew about some of the people in the land are able to speak that. But by the time of Christ, people were not too fluent in Hebrew. They would have known some. Probably would have even known in the time of Christ Aramaic, Biblical Hebrew, and Greek. Some might have even known Latin. So we have the idea maybe they weren't that, educated. You read in the Jewish sources, what children are expected to memorize and to learn, and it's a society that's focused on memorizing things. And they would, you were expected, if you followed a rabbi, to memorize everything the rabbi said.
Most everybody in the New Testament could speak two languages.
Certainly, yeah. Because Greek at that time, Greek is the official language throughout the empire. All right, any thoughts, questions before we take a break? All right, let's take a break for 7:10 to 7:10. Since we have it on hand now, I don't know if I'll need to write anything, but we'll see. All right, we're starting back. I guess you got that recording, AJ, because I don't know if I can do it more than one time. All right, so if you look on that handout, the political fortunes of Israel in the intertestamental period. So we have the Persian period, and the next big thing is up under that, conquest by Alexander in 331. So it's Alexander the Great and the Hellenistic period. His father is trying to conquer, all over the world. And Alexander, he was taught by Aristotle, and he's inspired by Achilles from the Iliad, a warrior. And when his father dies, he becomes the ruler, and he wants to conquer the world. He sweeps through the world and uniting all the different places. He brings with it democratic Greek ideals. He brings with it the language of the Greek people, and that's significant. And it caused also some problems in Palestine because, how are the Jewish people now going to respond to this pressure to become Greek? And some said, well, it's a good thing. I think we should do it. And then others said, no, we can't. Major libraries were founded. Jews were divided about this Hellenistic lifestyle. In 2 Maccabees chapter 4, it says that some of the temptations of this period were Greek forms of dress, which would have idolatry associated with it. Also, athletic competitions, male athletic competitions in the Greek gymnasia or gymnasium is where we get that word, and that gymnos means naked. So that's how they would compete. And that's going to have some significance too if you're circumcised or not, non-circumcised. There was an interest in sports, and worship and sacrifice were neglected. So all of that, in theater, and there are theaters in Palestine that date to this time. And some of the Greek theater is pretty explicit. And so there's tension that's there. Yet the good thing is the Greek language is spreading throughout the world, and the New Testament's written in Greek. Hebrew is not as precise as Greek. Greek's a very precise language. Greek's more difficult to learn than Hebrew. Hebrew is a simplified language. The main obstacle to learning Hebrew is, our English language comes from Latin and then from Greek, and so things look the same kind of. Hebrew doesn't look like that. It's just like, what is that? Yeah, scribbling. And some of the letters look extremely close to some of the other letters, and you kind of want to say, if you're making an alphabet, you need to make more distinction between the letters. But again, we talked about Hebrew as a pictograph language, but Greek is more precise in its grammar and even the meanings of words. Now, it doesn't mean there's like a magic, meaning of Greek. Like we've heard the word agape, love, or agapao, and usually I preach it and we've heard it, it's selfless, self-sacrificial love. Well, what are we going to do with that definition when we look at Matthew 5, where Jesus says, if you love those who love you, what good is that? And the word he uses is agapao love. So if you love others with selfless love and they love you back with selfless love, that's not what he means. So yet it's the same word that's used when it says God so loved the world, agapao. So the point is, it's not look up in a Greek dictionary some magic meaning and that transforms everything. The context has to tell us that. But we've talked about before that Jewish people are scattered all throughout the world, and that's important because they brought Greek or Hebrew thought, morals throughout the world, and Alexander's Greek language spreading. So all this is laying the foundation for a New Testament. And then you have the Septuagint that scholars say was written by 70 or perhaps 72. It's a translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. And Paul and others use that, and they quote that in the New Testament. So Alexander was conquering the world, and he brought some good things. And he conquered the Persian Empire. Well, he died, so you have Hellenism up there during that time. And he died in 323, and he had no heir to the kingdom, his kingdom. And so there was a struggle among his generals. And really there were 4 generals, and it got down to 3, and then basically 2 that relates to our history here. The Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Power struggle that's here. The northern half of Syria was under the Seleucids, and usually most of those rulers have names that have Seleucus in it, or Antiochus, or if you want to pronounce Antiochus. The southern half of the land, which is based in Egypt, is Ptolemy, and its leaders, most of the leaders have Ptolemy in their names. So Israel's in the middle of that. So you have the Seleucid and then the Ptolemies, And from 311 on, Israel is in the hand of the Ptolemies. So that's basically these from Egypt. And you have evidence of that in the land of Israel. It's a Ptolemy period when certain things. Let me see. The most famous ruler during that time was Ptolemy III, and you might have heard of him. He promoted scientific investigation, and some of his astronomers talked about how the Earth is a sphere, and they measured the circumference and things of that sort, and that's before Galileo. So Israel's under Ptolemy rule, and in 198, there on that block, the Seleucids are in control. The Seleucid ruler Antiochus III occupied and conquered Israel, and so that shifts the balance from the Ptolemies from the south to the Seleucids in the north. And so the Jewish people are under Syria rather than Egypt, is the idea. And Antiochus III ruled, and then Seleucus IV, and they're still given a certain amount of religious freedom, that's going on. But in 175, this guy of the Seleucids, Antiochus IV, came to power. And before that, there was pretty cordial relations between the Seleucids and the Israelite people. But when Antiochus IV came to power, he increased taxation, and he's also aggressively promoting Greek ideals, Hellenization, and even to the point he proclaimed himself as a god. And so you probably heard of him, Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes means manifest. So I'm a god, basically what he said. The one historian said that a lot of people didn't refer to him as Antiochus Epiphanes, but Antiochus Epimanes, and Epimanes means a madman. So he's not a god, he's a madman. And so the faithful Jews in the land, there's the conflict that's really increasing now. And they come to be called at the in that block there, after Hellenism and the arrow pointing, this Hasidic movement, or the Hasidic Jews. And there's later Hasidic movement in the 18th century, and that's different from this. Probably has roots in this. But Hasid means pious, and so the Hasidic, Hasidim, are the pious ones. And there are various names. I'm not going into all this. Jason, and he's wanting to be the priest, and he pays a bribe, and but he's outbid by somebody else, Menelaus. And Antiochus is trying. He's in Egypt at this time, and a rumor starts that Antiochus had died, and so there's celebration and rejoicing over that. Well, he didn't die, and so he comes back through Syria, going on his way to Syria, and he comes back through Palestine, and he goes into the temple, and he plunders the temple. He carries off the equivalent of billions of dollars of the treasury, and it says he allegedly massacred 40,000 Jews in one day. That's not when he goes in and offers a pig. That's before that. So he's keep going down to Egypt, and looting them. But the next time he comes through, he goes into Jerusalem again, and he sets fire to parts of the temple, and he slaughters a lot of people, and all this on the Sabbath, because he knew the Jewish people wouldn't resist. And he goes into the temple, and erects an altar, a pagan altar there, and offers a pig on the altar, and that defiles the temple area. Daniel 11 is talking about Antiochus and how this is going to happen. And Daniel talks about an abomination of desolation, a complete abomination. And he's referring to what Antiochus did when he defiled the temple. Now, Jesus, in Matthew 24, and we'll talk about this in the last class, Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem that is to come, and he references Daniel, and he says there's going to be another abomination of desolation. Let the reader understand. First Maccabees talks about that these events were in 167, and it says he erected a desolating sacrilege on the altar of burnt offerings. And that's not described anymore in Maccabees. Well, let me stop and see if you had comments or questions on Antiochus the fourth. Matthew 24, Mark 13, Mark 13, 14, Matthew 24, before verse 34. I don't know exactly what verse it's in there. All right, any other questions, comments?
During all this time, the Jews in Jerusalem and what small area they have outside of that are just kind of having to live under all of this rule of the pagans and all that. And,
Yeah.
But I know some of them are trying to maintain their faith, but obviously the Maccabees will obviously.
Yeah.
But they're living.
Scotty's told the rest of the story already.
They're living under all this.
Yeah.
World events, and like you said, always caught in the middle.
Yeah.
Between the north and the south.
Yep. Israel's a land bridge. All right. Thanks, Scotty.
40,000.
Yeah.
Because, we've been watching the news and saying how many people are killed in Maine or whatever.
Yep.
But that's such a small number compared to this. It would happen,
And it's not unique. It's not like just one time this happened in Israel's history. In various times there's been large numbers like that. Yeah, and then of course in the Holocaust. Well, as Scotty's already told you, this Antiochus was not unchallenged, and it started a revolt. There was an older priest, Mattathias, and he was ordered to offer a sacrifice on one of the unlawful altars that Antiochus had erected up in Judea. Modane is the place, and he refused. And a fellow Jew came up and said, "I'll do it," and he started to do it, and Mattathias took a sword and killed him, and then killed the Roman or the guard that's there. Who was overseeing, not Roman at that point, but the guard who was overseeing that. And then soon the priest and his 5 sons fled into the hills of Judea, and they organized a band of rebels. And they knew all those caves and knew all that land, and so it's guerrilla warfare. And so this is the Syrian army, not Assyrian, but Syrian army under Antiochus. And yet this small band of Jewish rebels are able to surprise them and attack them. And
Who was the priest? Was he Mattathias?
No. Mattathias is the older priest. He's the father of all the Maccabees. It's going to be called the Maccabees. So, yeah, he was a priest. He was ordered to offer this pagan sacrifice, and he not going to do it. And a fellow Jew jumped up and said, "I'll do it." And Mattathias took a sword and killed him and killed the soldier.
He finally had enough.
Yep. He died in 167, but his son is named Judas, and he was nicknamed Maccabeus, and Maccabeus comes from the Greek that means hammer. And so the idea is he's going to hammer these Syrian forces. And he led the attacks, and they were successful. So much so, even in First Maccabees, it said they were outnumbered as many as 6-1, and they're still victorious over them. By the month Kislev, and the 25th day of that, in the year 164, so on that chart, it's 164, the liberation by Maccabees, he was able to regain control of the temple and purify that, and to rededicate that, or dedicate it. And the Hebrew verb is kanak, to dedicate. And so that day becomes Hanukkah, a feast of dedication. And in John 10, verse 22, we're told that Jesus is teaching in the temple area during that time of that festival. And you think about that. Jesus is teaching, I am God, in the temple area at that time period. I mean, what happened to that other guy who was doing that? Antiochus Epiphanes. And so the people are probably thinking, but Jesus really is God. Antiochus is not God. And so the temple was cleansed, and there are stories, related to that. You probably heard about the oil not going out and things. That's roughly our December, that Hanukkah. Thoughts, questions on that?
Let's see. Did you say that Matthias died in 67?
He died in 166, and he's succeeded by his 3 sons, Judas, Jonathan, and Simon. Judas is the one who is leading the revolt, the hammer guy, Maccabee. Yeah, head of the militia, the head hammer, the main hammer. Any other comments, questions? It's through this line, this becomes the Hasmonean dynasty. And there's freedom for the land at that time. And at the end of this dynasty is a guy named Herod the Great. He's in that line. So Antiochus dies in 164. His successor, Antiochus V, is not so drastic. He even sent a letter, or Rome sent a letter and promising friendship. And Judas and his brothers continue to fight the Syrian forces for a little while, and there's about then following this 80 years of independence of the Jewish people. That's the golden age, thought of as a golden age of Jewish nationalism. And Rome ended that in 63 BC when they conquered the land. And the Jews would never again be a free nation until after World War II, in 1948, when they established the nation of Israel. So the Maccabean revolt, again, we're talking about some of these consequences that intensified Jewish-Gentile relations, because you got this guy that's doing all this. And so in New Testament times, that's really Jews and Gentiles. Jewish people don't like Gentile people. And in like Paul, when he goes to Jerusalem, he causes that riot, and he's arrested, and he's on the temple steps, and he gives that speech, and he spoke in Aramaic, and so they listened to him. Well, here's a guy, we need to listen to him. And they listened to his defense, and they listened to what he said about Jesus of Nazareth. And what they could not tolerate was when he says that the Lord told him, "Go, I'll send you to the Gentiles." And when they heard that, they said, "Rid the earth of him. We don't need him around. Let's get rid of him." So there's that conflict between Jews and Gentiles by the time of Jesus and by the time of Paul. So Judas Maccabee Maccabeus died, and he's succeeded by his brother Jonathan, and brothers Jonathan and Simon. And the Syrians still kind of control parts of this. They appoint Jonathan as high priest, and everybody recognizes he's not the guy, he's not a successor to this, but was accepted by a lot of people. He died. Simon succeeded him as military political leader. And from First Maccabees, the Jews and their priests decided that Simon should be the high priest forever. And so what this is turning into is, to be high priest is a political thing, and you can even pay for it. And so that's what you have in New Testament times. Simon died, and it goes to his son, and little by little, the ideals of the Maccabees, who are threatened by this opposition to Torah, is being lost. And in fact, there's even, during this time, Simon's son, John Hyrcanus, there's forced conversions of the Idumeans, and that's Herod's people. It's related to the Edomites. And he also set the stage for the problem between the Jews and the Samaritans, which has not been too great, as you know, as we've been seeing anyway. When John Hyrcanus destroyed a temple that the Samaritans had built in Mount Gerizim. And that's, again, I mean, the Samaritans, they only took the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, and their Messiah looks different from Jewish Messiah. And that's behind Jesus' encounter with that woman at the well in John 4. So the Hasidic people, the pious ones, you see up there, they're still going at this time. They supported the Maccabean revolt on religious grounds. Now they really protest the corruption that's in the priesthood and growing Hellenization. And it's probably from that group, the Chassidim, that we have the Pharisees calling the Jewish people back to obedience to the law. Finally, it gets down as the Maccabean reign and dynasty, and Rome is growing in power, and there are 2 sons who are quarreling who's going to be the next king, and they appeal to Rome for assistance, and Rome did assist because Pompey came in 63 and said, okay, I'll take over the whole land. And so that leads to the Roman period beginning in 63. All right, thoughts, comments, questions on disagreements on the Maccabean period?
Of course, during all of this, I mean, we know of no prophets or
No.
miracles or anything like that, but God is still working through people like the Maccabees and so on.
Yeah.
To preserve the Jewish bloodline.
Yeah.
For the Messiah, because that's still going. He's not born yet, so that's still going on.
Yeah. And there's still pious people, a few, pious.
Yeah.
And even with, the Chassidim are probably the origin of the Pharisees, and
It started with the best of intentions.
certainly, and it's not an accident. In the book of Acts, Paul says, I am a Pharisee. He didn't say I was a Pharisee. He said, I am a Pharisee. Are there good things about the Pharisees? Yeah. I think maybe because we know Matthew 23, where Jesus really, blasts the Pharisees, that we can't maybe see the good. It's just like saying all used car dealers are crooks. All preachers are lazy. You want to throw people in groups. And the Pharisees had good intentions, and some were loyal and devout. And in the book of Acts, you have the priests, many of the priests who obey the gospel. So even at the birth of Jesus, and John the Baptist's parents, there are devout people still in the land.
The fact too that the priesthood, not to get too far ahead of this period, but the fact that by Jesus' day and before the priesthood becomes so corrupt.
Yeah.
That Jesus is then called the high priest, and he's not from the tribe of Levi or anything, he's from a different tribe. That may have been some appeal about that, just from that standpoint.
Yeah.
This is a whole different, we got an outsider, to be the priest now.
Yep. Yeah.
When you get to Luke 3, how many of these people were in this intertestamental period? And when you were saying preserving the line, I was thinking about,
In the genealogy.
yeah.
Are you talking about Luke 1?
Well, I was talking about in Luke 3, like starting with verse 23.
Oh, okay, that genealogy, yeah.
It's got Zerubbabel in verse 27.
What verse?
27.
Yeah. So that's that's a long time.
If we weren't to know this, would we know anybody between Joseph and that? In the Bible, and then the second question is historically, if we weren't here.
I don't think any of these people. I mean, some of these people would be during that time period. They have to be, if it's leading up to Joseph. I mean, you got Mattathias in verse 25, but that's not the same. That's not the same guy. I don't think, and I may be wrong. Again, I guess I should say I don't know, but I don't think any of these are mentioned in outside sources of being during that time period. But again, if it's a genealogy and it's coming up to Joseph, then they had to be in that time period. So it's a good question. Any other comments or questions? All right, so we're up to the Roman period, which begins in 63. And this runs through the rest of the New Testament era. Rome, even from 280, in BC, they were expanding slowly, growing and growing. And we could go back to Daniel and see the statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw, and then what each of the parts represented, and the kingdoms. In the days of the last kings, God's kingdom will be established and will overcome the whole world. And so this is that time period. This is that Roman kingdom. It's during that time that God will set forth a kingdom that will not be destroyed. So Pompey is already knocking on Israel's door. Pompey invaded. Egypt fell to the Romans in 30 BC. They're continuing to grow, and they're expanding in all kind of places. I was able to lead mission trips to Scotland, and you can see ruins up there of Roman occupation in Britain and other places. And so they're spreading all over France, Spain, Germany. Pompey entered Jerusalem, and again, the last of the Maccabean, the Hasmonean rulers, Aristobulus II, when Pompey marched into Jerusalem, he decided, I'll stop him. But he was defeated, and Pompey put somebody that was more loyal as high priest, and an Idumean, Antipater, was given the political leadership. And Rome wanted to control. If they took places, they'll put client leaders there, and we can control them. And they would get taxes from them. Now, Rome was pretty open to the idea that Judaism would be a legal religion. It's not illegal. You can still worship as you want to worship. That's later exempted when some of the the early emperors, I don't think had the idea that they were gods. I mean, there's one of them, I can't think of his name, he's jokingly, when he was dying, he said, I think I'm becoming a god. He's making fun of everybody else, I think. But it's not until later, because really it's kind of stupid, you just think about that. But during this time period, Herod, Antipater's son, and the rightful heir to the Hasmonean throne are in conflict. And in 37 BC, Herod finally triumphed. And so that's in that next block there, Herod the Great. And he ruled as a client king for Rome. And the priesthood was a separate thing. The Romans appointed them. And so, like as I think Scotty brought out, you had in the time of Jesus, in the trial of Jesus, you have Annas and his son-in-law Caiaphas, and that whole thing's corrupt. And there's extra biblical documents that talk about how corrupt they controlled the markets, they controlled everything, they controlled when you're buying the sacrificial animals, and that's part of why when Jesus in this last week, earthly week, goes in and turns all the tables over and is upset over that. So in Judaism, the high priest was to be priest for life, but if you're appointed by Rome, you're there as long as that lasts. Annas had been appointed in AD 6 and deposed in 15. Caiaphas followed him behind that. So Herod is the great personality now. He built a lot of things. If we're ever able to go to the land of Israel, we can see some of his buildings. And Herod, of course, rebuilt the temple. He wanted to just destroy everything and start building over, and the Jewish people said, no, we don't think you'll rebuild it. And so he greatly expanded the Temple Mount, but it didn't matter. He built temples to pagan gods in other places. But he was a builder. He over at Caesarea Maritima, Caesarea on the seacoast. That's not Caesarea Philippi. That's up by the Sea of Galilee. On the seacoast, there was not a natural harbor, and he built a harbor there, Caesarea Maritima. There's a theater there that's built. He was a great builder. In the temple, although the Romans destroyed it in 70, there was a part of the retaining wall that stands, and that's the western wall. That's not the wall of the temple itself. That's part of the retaining wall. But that's a very holy place to Jewish people. When we were able to go, our guy was Jewish, and he wouldn't go in there. He said, I don't know if I could be walking around on the Holy of Holies and not know it, where it is. But that western wall is a holy place to Jewish people. So before Herod starts reigning, Julius Caesar had been assassinated. And Caesar's nephew is Octavian, and Mark Antony. They were allies at one point, and then they, going to try to take control. So now they're enemies. But Octavian defeated Mark Antony and his wife Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. And then Octavian took the title Augustus, like I'm the August one, and he reigned as the new emperor. Now, Herod's, it's really amazing about Herod. He's always, he's pretty politically astute. He's going to be, okay, so you're the new ruler now. I never did like the other guy anyway, and he was supporting Mark Antony, and now he's supporting Octavian, Augustus. And he quickly convinced Augustus that I can be loyal to you. And Herod had good relations with Rome. And behind all the building as well, he's active in bringing Hellenization and Romanization into Israel. But also, he's telling the Jewish people, I'm a Jew. I'm a convert to Judaism. Most of the population didn't like him because of that. There were those who followed him, and they liked that kind of rule, and they're called Herodians in the New Testament. So we have a lot of these things that have their origin. We have talked about the Pharisees. You have the Sadducees. You have the synagogue. You have political groups like the Herodians. You have other political groups like the Zealots. They'd be the kind of people that fly airplanes into buildings, and they hated Roman rule. Among the 12, there is one who is called a zealot. Is it Simon? Yeah. And among the 12, there is somebody named Matthew, who is a tax collector. And tax collectors, you just buy the franchise and you pay Rome whatever you make above that. They didn't care. You just paid, And tax collectors were hated. The rabbis said a tax collector couldn't testify in a court of law because they always lie. So you think about in that group, there's Matthew, the former tax collector, and then Simon, the zealot. But toward the end of his life, Herod became really paranoid. He had a lot of sons, and he killed some of them because he thought they were trying to take over the throne. He even killed his beloved wife, Mariamne. And some of these, you can read the records. Some of them, like so-and-so died in a swimming accident. It wasn't a swimming accident. Herod murdered him. One of it was Augustus remarked that you'd be better off if you were Herod's pig than Herod's son. And he said it in Latin, but there's a play in Greek on that. The word for son in Greek is weos, and the word for pig is wous. It looks the same, related, so probably the play's there in Greek. What he meant was Herod's given the impression he's not going to kill a pig because he's not going to eat a pig, but he'll kill his son. And so you'd be better off to be his pig than to be his son. The Jewish people didn't like him. He even gave the order, when I die, he told the soldiers, arrest prominent Jews and kill them. So he said, at least there'll be somebody that's crying when I die. Of course, they didn't do that, and Herod didn't know they didn't do that. So he was a builder, he's a politician, but he's trying to play all sides of it. And we don't have any evidence outside of Scripture, but it fits in with Herod, and I believe it's inspired about Herod killing the infants at the birth of Jesus. It's just right in line. He changed his will a bunch of times, and then finally in the block there it comes down to those 4 sons. All right, the thoughts, comments on Herod.
Toward the end of his life, he was just crazy. He was, I don't know.
Crazier might be, yeah.
I don't know if you'd say dementia or what, but he was clinically diagnosable, I think, of something, that paranoia and crazy, and just a lot of. He was an extraordinary politician in his prime, though.
In the sense that he could play all sides, I think.
Yeah.
Anybody else on Herod?
I'd heard, or maybe I just got the impression that a lot of his building projects for the Jews, which he thought that he'd be able to curry favor with them, that he'd become popular with them if he invested enough in their things that they considered sacred, and they never got past the fact that he's big man, he's foreign, or he's
Yeah.
he's not one of us.
And he did rebuild the temple, and it's an amazing, feat. Never did complete it really before it was destroyed, but and he did do that. But Jewish people hated him.
And were there, towards the end, when he's more crucifixes, and, I think I have this memory of reading about kind of a mass execution.
I think it's him. I don't know. I was reading that, and could have been one of his sons, but it fits in with him, if he did it.
I mean, he killed all the babies, so you'd have a hard time getting past that, I think, if you're the Jewish people.
Certainly. Killed his sons. If you're Herod's son, you got to be constantly looking behind your back, him and his wife, and he had several wives. So yeah, he wasn't a good guy. Anything else on Herod before we talk about for a few minutes how his kingdom divides? So finally, his kingdom comes to his sons, his three surviving sons, Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip. And Archelaus he didn't treat the Jewish people too great, and they got. They said we've had enough Herods, and they sent a delegation to Rome to appeal. We don't want any more Herods. Basically, they said, we don't want any more Herods, just send somebody directly from Rome and we'll take them. We can't put up with any more Herods. And Antipas and Philip eventually appeared in Rome, and Augustus is there, and Augustus decides to give Judea with Idumea and Samaria to Archelaus. Antipas received Galilee and Perea, and Philip the remaining provinces up in the Sea of Galilee. Jesus in Luke chapter 19 tells the story of a nobleman who was sent to a distant land to receive a kingdom, and he's opposed by the citizens. And a lot of people think that just fits right in with, because they all go to Rome to get all this sorted out. Archelaus keeps treating the Jews badly, and they appeal to Rome, and finally he's banished in AD 6. When Jesus' family returns from Egypt, they avoid Judea and they go to Galilee. Antipas ruled in Galilee. He was a builder as well, like his father. He built up a city that's not mentioned in the New Testament, but it was an important city. It's Sepphoris, Sepphoris, Sepphoris. Sepphoris. And Sepphoris was 5 miles from Nazareth. And during this time, in the time of Antipas, there's a lot of building activity going on. He's building that city 5 miles away. And so some scholars have suggested, in fact, one person wrote a book. The title of the book is Jesus and the Forgotten City, New Light on Sepphoris in the Urban World of Jesus. But he suggests that Joseph and Jesus might have found some work over there, as he is growing up. Because there's all kind of, it's like Madison or Huntsville is expanding, and there's all this building going on. By the way, Jesus and Joseph were tradesmen. They were craftsmen. The word, it would mean they worked in wood, but they could work in stone and other materials as well. Antipas remains until 39, and he fell into Roman disfavor, and he was banished. And Antipas is the Herod that appears in the adult life of Jesus in the Gospels. So Archelaus has been banished, and so Rome says, okay, well, we're going to put these procurators over Judea, Roman governors. We can control them, I guess. And the most famous one is Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate. And he succeeded in alienating the Jews more than any of the ones that went before him. I mean, a procurator position would be a mid-level management position, and you usually end up in the middle of nowhere, and you wouldn't be there for a long time. And the idea was just go there, kind of do your job, lay low, don't want to cause any problems, and then go somewhere else. And it's almost like Pilate deliberately is doing things to upset the Jewish people. And there's some interesting background behind that. But Josephus tells us a couple of things. The Bible tells us some things. But he took military standards and shields into the temple area in Jerusalem. And he did it at night because he knew the Jewish people would get upset over it. And when they found out, they go straight to his palace over in Caesarea Maritima, and they say, "You're going to remove that." And so these are the leaders, and they're standing there before Pilate, and Pilate says, "I'll just order my soldiers to kill you." So he brings all the soldiers in, and the Jewish leaders are there, and he says, "What are you going to do?" And the Jewish leaders go, "Kill us. Here's our necks." And Pilate knows he can't slaughter all these Jewish people right here in his palace. He's going to get back to Rome, so he removes the standards. Another time he took some funds from the temple treasury to build an aqueduct. Another time there were Samaritans who I think had discovered some treasure, and he thought it was an uprising. He sent soldiers out there and killed them all. In Luke 13, we have mention there of an uprising, and probably not the same one Josephus mentions, but it's along the same line. Now, he's really anti-Jewish, and he has a patron in Rome. So prefects or governors are mid-level, and they would have a patron, and his patron is Sejanus, Sejanus. Let me tell his story and then we'll stop. In Rome, and he is really anti-Semitic. And he's head over the Praetorian Guard. So he's a pretty high-level government official. And he's Pilate's patron, but he's anti-Semitic, hates Jewish people. Shortly before the trial of Jesus, Sejanus is suspected of treason, and they bring the charges, and he's executed. Pilate is probably thinking, everybody's looking at me now. And he's been anti-Jewish, up to this point. And then the trial of Jesus comes up, and he doesn't want that. He's already messed up all these, these other times. And what you don't want is news to get back to Rome. And then what did the Jewish people say to Pilate? Yeah, you're not a friend of Caesar. You don't want that getting back. And so Pilate, he seems to be more weak than cruel. That doesn't really harmonize with our portrait in other places, but it does. If that just happened, your patron is just been executed for treason. Next thing you know, they're looking at Pilate, and now the trial of Jesus comes up. How's he going to handle this? And then his wife said, she has a dream and tells him don't have anything to do with him. He just wants all that to go away. And then he finally says, I'm just wash my hands of this. And we know that you can't do that.
They really had him over a barrel.
Certainly.
They knew how to play it.
Yeah. And I'm sure they know probably of those events that just happened with Sejanus. There is a novel written by Paul Maier, I think, Pilate. It's a novel, but Paul Maier is a historian, ancient historian, or a historian in ancient things. He's not an ancient historian. I think it's written maybe in the 70s or 80s maybe, but it's in novel form about Pilate, and it brings up all these facts. It's true to the history, and it puts it in a way of a novel, in a format of a novel. But it talks about all this, how this comes up now, the trial of Jesus, and he has to deal with that. Okay, we're going to stop with Pilate. Any thoughts, comments, questions before we stop?
I have a question
Yeah.
about Josephus. What is it? It was 20 volumes, right?
Of Jewish history, antiquities.
That Josephus did.
Yeah, and then there's the wars, the Jewish wars, which is another work.
What are we seeing in the bookstores? Not 20 volumes. What?
It's usually an abridged, I think, what, Whitson? Is that his name? W-H-I? Whitson?
What has,
One volume.
Yeah.
what is deemed as the most important, or what?
It would be an abridged, like something that is abridged, like an abridged dictionary, I guess, or something. Yeah.
Like Josephus has one sentence about Jesus, and that abridged.
Yeah, yeah. I've read the abridged. I've never read the whole thing. I don't know if I could make it through the whole thing.
When you read the abridged, I mean, I've read bits and pieces, but when you read the abridged, there's a lot of Bible things that are there, right?
Yeah, because his history, goes back to the time of the Hebrew Bible as well, and he mentions, the patriarchs. Yeah, and a lot of that's going to be Jewish legend, and again, a lot of it is interesting and could be helpful in understanding even those Old Testament accounts.
I've got a copy of a book by Paul Meyer on where he's taken Josephus and he's taken the antiquities of the Jews and the Jewish wars and combined them and made it a kind of readable.
Paul Meyer wrote that? Okay, yeah.
It's really approachable, readable history.
Yeah, that novel on Pilate is really interesting and easy to read.
Is that like available now, or is
Yeah,
it in print?
yeah, it's in print.
What did you say it was called?
I think it's just called Pilate. I don't know. So how you spell it? M-A?
M-A-I-E-R.
Yeah, Paul Meyer. I don't know if he's still living or not, but and,
Pilate was, not the most skilled politician or leader, obviously, and that he got caught in a situation where the priesthood, they were very skilled and very ruthless.
yeah,
And they were bitter enemies anyway, and so they knew they could push him around enough. They knew what button to push to get what they wanted.
and it didn't help that he's already done all those things,
Yeah.
deliberately against the Jewish people.
And the fact that it's a feast and you don't want anything to blow up, Herod's in town,
Yeah.
just,
And Pilate is, I mean, his palace is over in Caesarea Maritima, but during feast time, they come over. They're all in Jerusalem because there's high messianic expectation, and there would be soldiers all over the place, and anything, could happen, a riot. So I remember reading about and learning about Sejanus as Pilate's patron, and I thought that was, when I first learned that, I thought that's just really amazing, because that explains a lot of his, because the Pilate at the trial of Jesus is not the Pilate that we know earlier. The Pilate we know earlier would basically say to the Jewish people, get out of here, I'm handling this. Something happened before the trial of Jesus for Pilate to try to get out of this whole mess. And then they say, you're not a friend of Caesar's. And he's scared, and his wife telling him that. So, all right, any other thoughts before we stop?
Well, it's kind of important though, even, I mean, as we keep seeing God working through maybe what we would see as the wrong thing. It's like, if he had been like he had been before, he would just, like you said, totally choose to go on, and Jesus wouldn't have been crucified.
Yeah.
he tried that first, but,
Which on the one hand would have seemed like good news, but it would have been terrible news for
Yeah.
the plan brothers.
God is, I don't understand all that. God is in control, and he's going to work his will. And that will is that we needed a Savior who died for our sins. All right, thank you. We're going to close. Glenn, you lead our closing prayer, please.
Well, we're so grateful for another day, a beautiful day that you've given to us in this evening. We can be gathered and engage in a study. We thank you for being in for the preparation. Put into this study. Pray that you continue to bless him, bless Carrie, she's recovering. Ask that you would help us to continue to have a hunger to know your word and to grow in it. And we may shine light to those who are around us. We pray that we will be transformed by the word that you've given to us. We're so grateful for Christ Jesus, who lives a perfect life and that he calls us to perfection. We pray that you'll help us to live according to his example, and we acknowledge that we often fail in following that example, and we ask for your continued forgiveness and grace. Thank you that those are also available through Jesus. We ask this prayer in his name.
Amen. Thank you. All right, so we're not having class next week, and I hope you have a good rest of the week. And then the next week, which is what, 9th? That's our last class, and we'll wrap up any loose ends and finish up to the destruction of Jerusalem. All right, thank you.